Speaker in the section on halacha is Yossi David, who has a doctorate from Hebrew University and an expert in Jewish law in the Islamic realm and in Arabic. He's worked up till now, I think, mostly in rabbinite texts, but he's now turning to the Epistle of Solomon Ben-David, Mariages, al-Fadl, on forbidden marriages.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me start with, again, thanks for the organizers and the great host here, and the great opportunity to exchange opinions and to learn a lot from our colleagues and friends. I'd like first to say some words of apology. It's a very good Jewish boy. Whoever expected me to discover new information about the epistle, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint him. And in fact, I won't talk too much about the epistle itself, but rather about some introduction to the whole issue of incest laws within the Karaite tradition. The more I worked and prepared my paper for this event, I realized that before starting to account on the epistle, we need some further introduction to Karaite law in general, but mainly to the laws of incest and what is it so significant in this field. But let me say a few words about the epistle, and because David mentioned before Shlomo ben David the Nasi and his other writings about incest laws, namely Makal fil Arayot, which people in the past at least tended to identify these two compositions, and which I learned from David, I think a year or 2 years ago, that we, of course, should distinguish between the two. I'm referring to the epistle, which was sent from Egypt. We're talking about the second half of the 12th century, to Constantinople, apparently to the Aharon ben Yehuda Baal Hadrashot Kusdini, which was the addressee, apparently as a response to his previous questions about incest laws. And apparently the epistle was initially written in Hebrew. We have some versions of it in various collections. Even some incomplete printed edition came out recently in the Chachmei Yosef volume 4, or 5 maybe. Yeah, it's already mentioned in Barry's list. But still we don't know about its background. We have some other accounts on this epistle from later periods, namely 14th century and on. Some of the accounts, or some of the reports, tells us that the epistle was actually dealing with Aharon's attempt to fight against the reform in incest laws, which is attributed to Yeshua ben Yehuda and his teacher Yosef Haroy, Yosef al-Basir. Some accounts actually tells us that they disagreed about some very minor nuances within the reform itself. Nevertheless, at least to some other accounts, it does reflect some differences subsequental to the reform itself between various streams which both agreed with the reform, nevertheless understood it differently. But I want to address now the issue of arayot in Karaite law in general, and maybe to address the challenges that Danny raised to us yesterday. And in fact, this is maybe the subtitle of our gathering, The State of the Field. So if we refer to what has been done by now, regarding the incest laws, obviously the answer is very little. It's very easy to mention that at least Isaac Marcon was aiming to print out anthology, 3-part anthology of incest laws, which eventually he printed only the first part, the Sefer HaYashar attributed to Yeshua ben Yehuda. The other parts, we have the plans that he wrote about it, and actually this project was based on his work, which he was granted a special prize for it. He wrote something about the Karaite incest laws and Christian ideas. Nevertheless, I never got to put my hand on this work, and I wonder if someone, of course, could assist me on that, or maybe to provide some further information about this work. But this was his motivation. Nevertheless, despite this work and some other encyclopedial entries, and only one study published by Nimoy in the late 70s, I'm afraid there is nothing more to discuss. Now, everyone who looks on Karaite legal books can realize that incest laws was a major issue within their discussion, as we already saw in the previous talk. I was always attracted to somehow understand the logic behind their incest laws. Initially, because I paid some attention to the Karaite attitudes towards Qiyas and the use of Qiyas, its limits, its methods, and incest laws are a very promising field. They deal a lot with variations of Qiyas. But also I was attracted to their approach, issues of kinship and family structure and so on. In fact, on our way here yesterday, David asked me how did I get to this epistle, and I answered him but just accidentally I came across this manuscript while sitting in the Bodley, and I was so excited I called my wife that evening and I told her, in fact it sounds in Hebrew much better, I told her, could you imagine what I discovered today? At יודעת מה גיליתי היום? And she said, what? And I said, well, I גיליתי עריות. I found איגרת on עריות. You could imagine her response. She said, well, I think it's about time that you come back home. So I did. In any event, while trying to analyze the content of the epistle, I realized that we know very little also about the whole controversy between the Mirakvim on the one hand and between the later authorities. That's the way they present them on the major narrative. What was it about? And mainly, and that's the question I want to address right now here with the sources with you. Could you please pass out the handout? I want to raise the question whether the issue about incest law and the reform taken by Yeshua ben Yehuda was about any systematic principles or something else. Now, before going on, I would like also to pick up on Danny's challenges from yesterday. And when he asked, where do we take the state of the field from here on? So I would like to propose that maybe one of the possibilities would be to carry it on behind the circles of Judeo-Arabic or the history of the Karaites and sometimes the polemics against the Rabbinites, whether we could extend our discourse and discussion and integrate it with general conceptual history or general historical analysis of institutions, whether legal institutions or some other practical institutions. And in that regard, I want to address mainly the institution of the family or kinship, which I would like to propose to view the Karaite incest law as a way to uncover different approaches to family issues and kinship in general. Before that, let me also just, since we all report on our ongoing projects, I would just like to add some other comment just to explain how it relates to my other projects. The general project which I'm interested in is what I call by now the morality of belonging, in which I deal with the various institutions, both from legal and theological perspectives. I try to look at such institutions and to realize what kind of mechanisms work there, how do they approach the problem of identity vis-a-vis difference, who's in, who's out, how one individual is converting into some group, meaningful group, how he steps out. In one of the themes which I looked at was the issue of adoption, which, as David Powers has shown in his recent book, which we just discussed earlier before, is also a very interesting issue in early Islamic law. It's also very interesting, of course, in early Christian writings, mainly following St. Paul, ideas about conversion, equalized to adoption in a way, and why the rabbis in the first century, in fact, rejected this institution to be a recognized legal institution up to this day, according to the rabbinic halacha. And this also relates to the issue of arayot, as we shall further see. Now, how are we to understand the Torat HaRikuv, the doctrine of the Rikuv, which the Reform was taken against? As I said before, one of the themes which is shared by all later writings is that the theory of the Rikuv was held by early Karaites for 600 years maybe, and then came Yosef el-Batzir, and followed by Yeshua ben Yehuda, which they fought against the Torat HaRikuv, and eventually their reform was accepted. Why was this reform needed? What was it about? So one explanation, which is very commonplace in later writings up to this day, is that in fact the way that the theory of the Rikuv restricted the extent of possible marriages within the community put the Karaite communities in real stress to the point that they couldn't, in fact, marry each other because most of them became relatives to each other, and therefore the reform was needed on a sociological base. Or put it differently, this explanation, I would call it a consequential explanation, namely that there was a need to put out the reform, and then, therefore, there was a need to establish the arguments, hermeneutical arguments, legal arguments, whatever was there, just to save the Karaite small communities at that time. Now, the problem with this kind of explanation is, actually, there are two problems. The first problem is that, to the best of my knowledge, I don't know of any earlier accounts on some social problem of these small communities to marry each other. I think that this whole theme appears only in later writings. But more seriously, I think the assumption that the more a society had restrictions on intermarriages actually is a problem, I think is also to be revised, or at least from our point of view these days, mainly following Claude Lévi-Strauss, we know that incest taboos or incest restrictions actually encouraged the extension of communities and encouraged mobility between communities. So I think this kind of explanation might be put in doubt, and therefore I prefer maybe to look at other explanations. Now, by the way, who's responsible for the reform? In most of the writings, we know that Yusuf al-Basir and his disciple Yeshua ben Yehuda are the heroes of this reform. Nevertheless, we have other accounts, other narratives. For example, from the composition I brought with me to this convention, and this is actually Sefer Arayot, written by Moshe ben Eliyahu Bashetzi, in which he accounts on the various controversies about Arayot against the Rabbanites, but not only. He brings further details that we were not aware to, but he's saying the following, and I will first say it in Hebrew as I quote it and then translate it. וחכמי תושבי רומים סברו כי רבי ישוע לבד ניצח המרקבים, ואינו כן, כי הרב הגדול רב סעדיה הנשיא ניצחם בראיות ברורות והוראות אמיתיות מהכתוב, והרגיעם כי צדקו אמריו. Right? And so the people of Byzantine, and actually he goes, on his account on the Arayot, he makes a clear distinction between the Karaites in Egypt, Palestine, Syria, against the Byzantines, and apparently they held different opinions. He actually accounts also on an attempt to revive the Merakvim theory by Byzantines, but at least here it draws the distinction. The Chachmei and the Karaites and Byzantines thought that Yeshua himself won the Merakvim, and this is not true. But rather, the great Rabbi Rav Saadia Nasizal, he won them in clear arguments, and his answers were right. So going a step further from the consequential explanation, I'd like to propose other explanations, substantial explanations, which we also find, again, in the writing themselves. So the first explanation that we see is that they had a tendency to be more restrictive on issues of arayot. They had natu leachmir, as some of them say. They don't explain why, but they say, these early authorities, for some reason, they had the tendency to extend the prohibited marriages, and the reform was actually a way to clarify the real decrees, the real biblical decrees. Another explanation is that they actually misused the method of qiyas. This is a very familiar explanation, and it has to do with the term rikuv. By the way, which we don't find the term rikuv held by those people who ascribe to have the rikuv. This is an external description of those who contrasted the rikuv. But according to this explanation, actually they took the method of the qiyas a step further, or maybe a few steps further, much more than they should have done so, and therefore they actually extended the list of prohibited marriages. Now, but above these two explanations, which one is the matter of method, one is a general tendency, I think there is a much more interesting explanation, much more substantial, and this is the one which is related to the idea of basar echad, guf echad, or nefesh echad, namely one flesh, one body, or one soul, which we find both also in the Merakvim writings and also with their opponents. So going up to substantial explanations, I want to suggest three features or three characteristics of this reform. One of them, and mainly following Bashetzi's account, the reform was actually a transition from jurisprudence which was based on seeking the meaning of incest laws to some more formalistic approach. According to Moshe Bashetzi, arayot is something that we have no explanation on that, mitzvot shemiyot, or chukim, similar to Para Aduma. And so by that he explains why many of his contemporaries didn't deal with arayot at all, because these are not rational commandments whatsoever. So one way to look at the reform is actually to see a transition from a phase where arayot was fully approached as rational decrees, rational commandments, and therefore to seek to understand the logic behind the verses, to some other jurisprudential approach which is much more formalistic, based on deductions and qiyas and so on. Another characteristic of the reform is a semantic issue, according to which the Mirakvim took biblical metaphors too seriously, according to their opponents. So, for example, if there is the verse, Lo yishkav ish et bat eshet achiv ki achuto hi, while the Mirakvim took it as she is his sister, therefore that's the reason why he shouldn't be in contact with her. Their opponent says, well, this is not really literal, this is only by analogy, this is a metaphorical way, and you shouldn't draw any legal conclusions from this biblical usage. But above that all, I think that there are different or distinct approaches to what kinship is about, or what family blood kins is about, and this is what I would like to propose here for discussion, or maybe as an explanation for the reform itself. So with your permission, I propose here a few sources to follow. And when we talk about the idea of being one flesh, which implies various restrictions, of course, our first connotation goes back to early Christian writings. And here we have it on the first page, three sources from the New Testament which exemplify how the verse from Genesis, and for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh, actually has some normative implementations. For example, the understanding of love between spouses is described as an extension of the self. Why a person should respect and love his wife? Because he should treat her, because she is in fact part of his own self, because they were united to one flesh. This is at least one of the accounts about the ban on divorce. Once they became one united entity, there is no option to actually dismantle this reunion. And this is also applies to the attitude towards fornication, and which we know actually that the tradition, according to this source, went on at least to the 9th century, when a person went to a prostitute. Sometimes he was forced to marry her because the very corporal encounter actually established or created or recovered some united entity, again according to the verse of Genesis. But if we look about other approaches to the implementations of this verse, we see that it was not only about personal implementations, but also something that has to do with the general social texture. If any physical or even a wedlock between people actually combine them to be one entity, therefore, sooner or later, families are also united to each other. And in fact, what we see here is an extension of the society to be part of one kinship, or to actually create, and I use the honor of the presence of Professor Blitzstein in his early work, which he dealt about the approach attitudes towards kibud avaim and family relations, this is in fact reflects the idea of creating a new siblinghood of the Christian community in which siblinghood and one kinship gathers more than the natural or the original core family. This we can see in various sources. I just picked out one of the explicit legal expressions from the Galtian Decretium, 12th century. Now, I'd like to claim that, in fact, we should think about the Merakvim insistence on the unity of man and wife and the idea of basar echad, one soul, one body, one self, in fact, as one of the fundamental pillars of their theory. And for that sake, I brought here two examples. One by Kirkisani, who was actually part of the Merakvim school, and the other from Yeshua, who actually presents the Merakvim ironically. So the first source from Kirkisani here on source number 5, we can see a good expression of one of the other aspects of Unitas Carnis, and I will quote. We have already explained that when a man marries a woman, his status is the same as hers. Whosoever of his own kin is forbidden to one of the couple, the corresponding kin of the other is likewise forbidden to him. Hence my wife becomes my brother's sister, and so does her sister. And should my brother marry her sister, he would be marrying his own sister. And later on, towards the end of the passage, the same rule applies to the man and his son marrying two sisters, to a woman and a daughter marrying two brothers. So obviously we see here that something is more principled, much something more systematic, according to which kinship is about spreading some identity. Or as we could further describe it, as extending the individuality behind the person's individuality. Let's sharpen this concept by the quotation from Yeshua ben Yehuda. Now, from their reasoning, it follows that if the wife and her second husband had likewise became one individual with the former husband, then she and her first husband had likewise become one individual. It is to be assumed that the one husband and the other also become one individual. This being proven, it follows that if the first husband had a wife other than the one who later married the second husband, this other wife and the second husband also become one individual. And I skip one line, whereof the second husband and the other wife of the first husband are likewise one. Therefore, he, in a way, of course, from his point of view, is trying to represent their stance ironically, but he's actually talking about extending oneself or one individuality between totally distinct persons. Therefore, the second wife of the first husband and the second wife of the second husband, which could be from totally different generations, never met, are considered halachically part of the very same self. Now, following this perception, Yeshua also blamed them that they actually create multiplicity of family members. And according to that view, a person has not only one father and one mother, but much more than that. And I'm following in the next passage. According then to this principle, a person has no less, of course he means possibly, he could possibly have, no less than 5 fathers. The real father, the mother's new husband, who by marrying the mother becomes the father, the husband of the wife of the father, the man who marries the other wife of the husband of the mother, And in fact, any man who marries any other woman who at any time was married to one of the aforementioned forefathers. So here we see something much more principled. Now, how to understand that? And mainly in regard to previous sources, which, as I said before, are very central to the early Christian theology. Now, I want to propose that there is some notion, as you can see it on the title of this page, contagio carnalis. In fact, I will later explain where I take this term from. According to which kinship or identity is something more dynamic, moreover, is something that is transferable. And the use of this metaphor as contagio carnalis, in fact, hints that kinship is understood through the trope of disease and contagions. Right? So once a person is in touch or is in contact with other person, and they are declared to be one part of the same self, the Karaites don't draw the conclusions that St. Paul take, that they could not separate whatsoever, but that some part of his identity, his or her identity, is going on with him and carries on. Of course, the question will be, till when, where it stops. But this question is always bothering. But this is something else that we thought about identity and kinship according to previous perceptions. So let me just quote one of the good examples for this perception in source number 8, taken from a person in a totally different context, Urbanus Maurus, early 9th century. And I'm reading the following. Because we are kin, my flesh is one with my brothers. When my brother marries by virtue of sanctity of marriage, his wife's flesh becomes his and by extension mine. If one sleeps with a woman who sleeps with another man, who sleeps with another woman, who sleeps with me, then my flesh is inextricably bound up with the flesh of that first man. I assume that many of the Israelis around this table might recall one of the advertisements against AIDS or the use of condoms, which actually used the very same idea. When you sleep with someone who slept with someone who slept with someone else, you actually sleep with the first. But actually, I think it's accurate in this regard because, as I said before, identity, or in my terms, the way of belonging here is something that is transferable, analogized to disease or contagion. Now, I will skip now also the source from St. Augustine. It is a very important source in that regard. Let me just say that Augustine in many ways preceded Claude Lévi-Strauss because he actually established the very same idea that exogamy is encouraged just to create more exchange and mobility between communities and not for some other reasons. In fact, by the way, the first time that this logic appears, I think it's within Philo. Philo's writing, he gives this idea in a way, but he provides other explanations, so it is not developed there. But maybe let me just read the last line of St. Augustine. Then the sexual intercourse of men and women is, in the case of mortals, a kind of seminarum est civitatis, or as we have in some later medieval versions, seminarium est caritatis. Namely, the whole idea of incest taboos, incest restrictions, is actually to encourage exogamy and to spread out love, to spread out virtues, to spread out, and in fact to extend kinship to other communities. Now, the idea of something which is transferable in this regard is something related to identity and kinship, might be related to what Professor Shama Friedman wrote about, that in early halakha there was some notion of transferable kedusha, and by that he explained actually the Mishnah about Kitvei HaKodesh metamim et hayadayim, and so he actually argued there that this kind of notion of kedusha, which is dynamic and transferable, was later abandoned by Chazal and replaced by other notion of kedusha. But this might be the case with the Karaites. Now, so far I tried to outline the principle that the Baalei Harikuv held, and in this regard, I think that what the Reform did is actually provided a new approach or a new reasoning to kinship, family relations, and therefore also to incest laws. What I propose is that there is a shift, or there is a transformation from a reasoning which was based on the meaning of unification, the meaning of intercourse, to some other structural reasoning. And therefore, it goes along also with the characterization of the shift from substantial approaches, seeking the reasons, the te'amim of arayot, to a much more formalistic jurisprudence. And in that regard, I would like to start with, again, quote from Moshe Bashietzi, which is one of the very good examples to illustrate the structural approach. According to this approach, it's very important to describe, or I must say to situate, the individual within the general framework of the kinship. Therefore, the two metaphors that are very significant and important for that is, one, the ikarim v'prachim, or shorashim v'anafim, which of course recalls the main metaphor that we know from the fiqh literature and the usul al-fiqh literature, usul and furu. And the other metaphor is of wings. One could imagine that the basic metaphor which represent the connections between parents and their and the children is following the first metaphor, namely the shorashim ve'anafim, and the wings metaphor actually illustrates the brothers, the cousins, and I would say all the horizontal relations. So let me again first read the Hebrew. I didn't get the chance to translate it, assuming that this very prestigious linguistic form might follow the Hebrew source, and then I might pick on some specific sentences. דע שהאב והאם יקראו בשם עיקרים מפני שהם שורש האיש ועיקר מקום נוקרתו וחוצבתו. And I skip two sentences. ומפני שהם שורשי האיש ועיקר הווייתו, שוגר בפי החכמים בשם עיקרים. וזהו עילת איסורם עד למעלה בלי הפסק. Right? When we talk about the vertical kinship, father, son, mother, daughter, then the band or the restrictions goes all the way up and all the way down. Until Adam HaRishon and later to come generations. ואפילו שלא יש ראיה לאב שאיסורו תלוי... Okay, I'll skip that too. And I start from the sentence, starting with, וכן ראינו שהכתוב קורא לאבי האב אב, שנאמר ותבואנה יראו אל אביהן, והוא אבי אביהן, שאביהן האמיתי היה יתרו, וכתוב אביך הראשון וכו' וכו'. והאח והאחות נקראים כנפיים מפני שאין בהם טבעיות שאריות. We actually distinguish between not only two metaphors, but between natural she'erut, natural kinships, and so to say, derivative kinship, or as he later says, she'er le she'er. Namely, knafayim, actually, the Horizontal kin relations is something that is not the natural kinship. It's only secondary one. כל שורש ועיקר קבוע, therefore, identity, kinship, is something stable, is something fixed, is something unchangeable, is something not transferable, אלא שאריותם הוא ארעי, מפני שאבי הוא שורשי ועיקרי, ובני הוא פרחי וסעיפי. נמצא שהאב והבן קשורים הם זה בזה, כשלהבת בגחלת, וכן נטמנים בזאת המדרגה האם והבת, כי אבי ואמי הם שאריי האמיתיים הקרובים, ואחיי ואחיותיי הם שארי, כי אין לי נערגות, I have no intervenience, נערגות, ונפתלות כלל עם אחיי ואחיותיי, כמו שיש לי נערגות ונפתלות עם אבי ואמי. Now, in fact, to the best of my knowledge, the reference to the metaphor of family structure, according to the פרחים, שורשים ופרחים, שורשים וענפים, appears only in the post-reform writings. Even if you find some examples, they're not something that is crucial to their account or their explanation. And obviously, it's not something that competing the principle of Vayu lebasar echad, which is the major lead in that regard. Now, from this, I want to skip to maybe, again, unexpected source, which our previous exposition might shed light on. And this is one of the accounts that Maimonides has on Isurei Arayot, the prohibitions of incest. So with your permission, I will read that. As you can see, that's the last source. The prohibition of incest includes another matter. By the way, the previous matter that he mentioned is the classic philosophical account, according to which the rationale behind incest laws is actually to reduce sexual activity at all, which it's very typical to the philosophical trend from antiquity and later on. But the second explanation is the following. Namely the considerateness of chastity. And such occurrence between the root and the branch, i.e., an intercourse of a man and his mother, or his daughter, is a great disgrace. For this reason, the intercourse between root and a branch is prohibited. And it makes no difference whether the root sleeps with the branch with the root, or both root and branch combine in the intercourse with the third person. So that the same individual is exposed to both the root and the branch. On this account, it is prohibited to marry a woman and her mother, the wife and the father, or the son. Obviously, he takes the conceptual metaphor used by the Karaites, and again, to the best of my knowledge, I didn't find any previous reference in rabbinic writings regarding incest laws with reference to this terminology. But more than that, brothers are like root and branch. The sister is forbidden, and so is also the wife's sister and the brother's wife, because it is an involvement of two persons who are considered root and branch. Prohibit with the third person. But in the prohibitions, but in these prohibitions, brothers and sisters are partially considered as root and branch, and partially as one body. The mother's sister is therefore like the mother, and the father's sister is like the father, and both are prohibited. Now, here what we see here, first, a clear reference to the terminology used by the Karaite halachic discourse about incest. But more than that, he also takes the position against what later by Shetzi attributes to Yeshua ben Yehuda, according to which that siblings are actually also part of the root and the root and branch system. We also, I think it should be further analyzed, but it's not clear why he insists that brother and sister are sometimes considered terach ve'anaf and sometimes not wings, but one body, one united body. Nevertheless, I will stop here. I will just say that going back to Danny's question, where do we take it from here? As I said before, I think we should integrate this kind of discussion with the general inquiries about conceptual understandings of social institutions, social structures. And in that regard, I think that the contribution of the Merkavim literature is enormously significant to the general discourse. Well, I will stop right here.
Comments, questions?
We have one question. To become a kinship, it's enough to sleep with someone, or you have to marry him, according to what you read in Yeshua?
In Yeshua, well, I didn't present his stance, but we do find discussions about that, whether you need corporal contact or whether the sacrament or the ritual would be sufficient. I can tell you that at least in the Christian writings, there is a general tendency to prefer the corporeal contact above any ceremonial conjuncture. More than that, some of them explicitly said, following, by the way, the quotations from the New Testament, that corporal contact actually prevails any other association, and therefore, by the way, there are some Aaron Shemesh wrote about it. There are some also remnants of this perception in the Qumran halachic writings, with some maybe remnants also in the Midrashic literature, as he claimed to. The idea that actually corporal contact is much more significant than other contacts, and what creates the new entity or the new self, the new identity, is the physical contact. Yes.
So for Yeshua, corporal contact would be enough. It's like in Mishnah, Shtar Kesef Uviyah, it's enough to be a...
No. Well, you know, I think that one of the fascinating things, which I guess everyone around this table experienced, when you read the Hebrew translation of Sefer Yashar, of Yeshua, we also shared that experience yesterday. You actually, you might understand every in each word, you might understand the general syntax, but you understand nothing of the content. This is the very initial experience when you read first. Now, I think you could gain some more, and mainly when we have now the Arabic source in the Firkovich collection. But there are also some other articulations of Yeshua's positions. Now, I didn't present here Yeshua's position. It's much more complicated. And still, I think it's still work to be done, because our main sources to Yeshua are generally our secondary sources, and there's a gap between them all. But basically, Yeshua sticks to the structural analysis of Prachim and Ikarim, and he picks a lot about the correct usage of the Kiyas methodology. And he actually makes 9 arguments, or nine positions, how should one use analogies, and by a right way of using these analogies, he won't get to the extreme conclusion of the Merkavim. So for him, it's actually a totally... By the way, he clearly said that one should not take the verse Vayu lebasar echad literally. He said this is only to express their intimacy and express their intimate love or something like that. Nevertheless, it's nothing metaphysical. It's nothing that we should draw some legal conclusion of. He clearly said that. Yeah. Pardon me?
It is metaphysical. It's nothing physical.
I said, well, according to Yeshua, it's not something metaphysically significant.
Okay.
It's only, yeah.
Okay.
But from the text that you included in your handout, it seems that for Yeshua, the determining factor is the personal status and not corporeal relationship. For him, once a person is declared husband or wife, this is what matters, and not anything else. This is clearly comes out from the text.
Mm-hmm.
Then a divorce would undo it, although according to this text it doesn't.
Pardon me, let me just... first of all, the quote from Yeshua here is actually representing the Merakvim position. Right? Nothing here...
But nevertheless, these are the important terms for him, husband, wife.
Right.
Unlike the text of... Abanus Maus.
Yeah. No, but it's more than that. For him, also siblings are important. Now, generally, they make following Yeshua, there is a distinction between she'ar and devek. She'er and devek. Davek. Between something which, again, going back to the terms of Baishetzi, some natural kinship and something which is artificial way to create another kinship. Therefore, marriages is...
Meaning some kind of a ceremony or...
No, well, it could be both. It could be both. It doesn't say here. Well, he said about marrying, getting in the wedlock. It doesn't say here. It doesn't refer here. By the way, no, there is a discussion. There is a discussion, for example, why the father's wife is restricted for the son. Now, Yeshua, in one of these discussions, raised the possibility that she is restricted for him for two reasons. One, because his father slept with her. And therefore, actually, this draws on the whole theme, which is further elaborated on their writings. This is the issue of tfusa, anusa ve'atfusa. The anusa ve'atfusa is actually, they are not in a wedlock,
yes,
but they did have some corporal connection.
yes.
Ve'mefuta, right. These all three terms go together. Mefuta, anusa, so this makes the distinction, and indeed, by the way, going back to the Epistle of Shlomo ben David, this is one of the major themes which he is in disagreement with his correspondent, is the theme of anusa mefuta. Now, one of the post-reform position was that the problem with the father's wife is a double problem. One is that he slept with her, and the other one that he got in martial connections with her, namely some official marriage. Of course, that complicates the issue. I'm not saying that the post-reform position rejected at all any meanings of unification, right? But they actually changed the weight of the issue from substantial understanding of what kinship is to some formal legalistic understanding, which is, it's a matter of taste and sometimes a matter of emphasis. Yeah. I'm sorry, I missed that point about divorce. Yeah.
I just thought, when you discuss what is more important, corporeal contact or some ceremony, then I thought, if the ceremony were important, a divorce might undo it. Whereas if corporeal contact were important,
now, I don't have
divorce wouldn't matter.
Yeah, obviously you're right. I don't have a clear account on the various positions on that topic, but I can tell you that some of them insist, for example, that they become one soul, which again has nothing to do with corporal encounter. And some of them insist that they should be termed one basar echad, one body, one flesh or one body, guf echad. So maybe that also can tell us something about what is more important in that regard.
So, just to clarify, for the reformers, did they go back to the basics in the biblical text, or did they still have something which was in between the extreme of the?
Again, it's a work to be done. I think this exploration has not been done yet. But I would avoid saying that they go back to biblical understanding. I'm not sure that this is the plain biblical understanding whatsoever. I think they have a clear notion of what coupling is, of what should be the legal implementations of coupling. And of course, they claim that they read it in the biblical verses. By the way, it also sheds light about a topic which it's not discussed enough, the relations between Karaite thought and theology vis-a-vis Christian ideas. Professor Gill stressed that point earlier before. Again, going back to Macron work, I think should also reveal some thoughts about that. But obviously here, by the way, if you compare some Christian ideas about contagio carnalis and the Merakvim ideas, you might ask yourself, I'm not talking about influence, but maybe there is something simultaneously developing in various traditions at the same time. Of course, we have to check all the Eastern Christian writings against the Karaite writings. It's, again, another field to be worked on.
I would like to better understand the comparison you make with Maimonides. Apart from the metaphor, what do you gain from the comparison? The results are totally different.
Of course. No, but first of all, I think metaphors are important. They are mainly important when Maimonides is unique on that. As I said before, I know none of the rabbis before Maimonides who refers to this terminology when talking about incest issues or kinship.
Well, the principle of usul and furu appears everywhere.
Right, but not in regard to these issues. This is much more principled issue. Right? He describes the relationship, how to understand the relationships between a son and a father. And I'm not getting into talking about Christianity, which filial relationships in Christianity is, of course, a very charged issue. This is not the case here. But again, how to describe the relationships between a father and a son. Whether you described it as, for example, within the logic of the Roman law, you would pick other metaphors. The son is the property of the father. Therefore, he could also execute him to some extent, until some period. He could sell him or her. This is a totally different metaphor. Now, when you talk about reflecting the relationships between the father and the son as something more organic, which also imply the hierarchy, that's actually explained. The idea behind that, why a son cannot sleep with his mother, because the hierarchy is as such that the root precedes the branch, and you should keep this kind of order or organization within the family and within the society in general. You actually, allowing incest is in a way destructing the whole organizational idea or the organizational logic of society at all.
The metaphor of root and branch doesn't help that.
Well, I think it does help. For example, it does reflect on the issues about the how you refer to the siblings, whether they are part of the same tree or there are some additional extensions, right? Wings. Now, it has to do, by the way, this is one of the future taxonomy to see how this metaphor also implies on laws of inheritance.
Yeah, what I'm
You
trying
could-
to make is the point that all this is Gzerat HaKatuv. All this is Gzerat HaKatuv.
Well, Rambam doesn't say Gzerat HaKatuv.
Well, but this is what is meant by that.
Well, I don't know. At least to the first explanation that he draws has nothing to do with Gzerat HaKatuv. He said that this is actually the general struggle of philosophy and religion against sexuality and corporal tendencies whatsoever. It has nothing to do with Gzerat HaKatuv.
Nachmanides says that the best marriage in the world could be a brother and sister.
Of course.
But we only avoid that because of Gzerat HaKatuv.
Yeah, Nachmanides, of course, has a very interesting criticism about Maimonides here, saying that actually it doesn't lower down sexual passion whatsoever, because a person still allows to marry 1,000 women outside his family. So what do you gain of this? This is the main criticism that Nachmanides, and he says, obviously, one should prefer. No, he doesn't say Naval B'Shut Torah. By the way, when Nachmanides takes that to mysticism, this criticism actually leads him to refer to Sod HaArayot, which is it's a different issue. Sod HaArayot, the incest issues in the mystical tradition is a totally different issue, which, just briefly saying, that there is a major gap between incest restrictions on earthly connections and the approval, and more than that, the promotion of incestual relations within the heavenly powers, namely with the Sfirot. So Sod HaArayot is something else. It's also a different metaphor, by the way. You refer to totally different metaphors there.
Okay, thank you very much. We now have to discuss some